Welcome back. My name is MyLinda Butterworth, and we are continuing our reading of the life and adventures of Santa Claus. Let's continue. Today we start with chapter 4, Claus. Another day brought Nasile's bower, the most popular place in the forest. The nymphs clustered around her and the child that lay asleep on her lap with expressions of curiosity and delight. Nor were they wanting in praises for the great ox's kindness and allowing Nasile to care for it. Even the queen came to peer upon the innocent child and to hold the helpless, chubby fist in her own. "What shall we call him, Nasile?" asked the queen smilingly. "He must have a name, you know." "Let's call him Claus," answered Nasile, "for that means little one." "Oh, rather let's call him Nicholas," returned the queen, "for that means Nasile's little one." The nymphs clapped their hands in delight, and Nicholas became the infant's name, although Nasile liked best to call him Claus. And after many days, many of her sisters also followed her example. Nasile gathered the softest moss in all the forest for Claus to lie upon, and she made his bed in her own bower. Of food, the child had no lack. For the nymphs searched the forest for bell udders, which grow under the goa tree, and when opened are found to be filled with sweet milk. And the soft-eyed does willingly gave a share of their milk to support the little stranger, while Shiegra, the lioness, often crept steadily into Nasile's bower and purred softly as she lay beside the babe and fed it. So the little one flourished and grew big and sturdy day by day, while Nasile taught him to speak and to walk and to play. His thoughts and words were sweet and gentle, for the nymphs knew no evil, and their hearts were pure and loving. He became the pet of the forest, for Ox decree had forbidden beast or reptile to molest him, and he walked fearlessly wherever his will guided him. Presently, the news reached the other immortals that the nymphs of Burzee had adopted a human infant, and the act had been sanctioned by the great Ock. Therefore, many of them came to visit the little stranger, looking upon him with much interest. First the Ryls, who are the first cousins to the wood nymphs, although differently formed. For the Ryls are required to watch over the flowers and plums and plants as the nymphs watch over the forest trees. They search the wild world for food required by the roots of the flowering plants, while the brilliant colors processed by the full-blown flowers are due to the dyes placed in the soil by the Ryls, which are drawn through little veins in the roots and the body of the plants as they reach maturity. The Ryls are very busy people, for their flowers bloom and fade continually, but they are merry and light-hearted, and they are very popular with the other immortals. Next came the Knooks, whose duty is to watch over the beasts of the world, both gentle and wild. The Knooks have a hard time of it, though, since many of the beasts are ungovernable and rebel against restraint. But they know how to manage them. After all, you will find that certain laws of the Knooks are obeyed by even the most ferocious animals. Their anxieties make the Knooks look old and worn and crooked, and their natures are a bit rough from associating with wild creatures continually. Yet they are the most useful to humanity and to the world in general, as their law are also the only laws the forest beasts recognize, except those of the Master Woodsman. Then there were the fairies, the guardians of mankind, who were very much interested in the adoption of Claus because their own laws forbade them to become familiar with their human charges. There are instances on record where the fairies have shown themselves to human beings and have conversed with them, but they are supposed to guard the lives of mankind unseen and unknown, and if they favor some people more than others, it's because they have won some distinction fairly, as the fairies are very just and impartial. But the idea of adopting a child of men had never occurred to them because it was in every way opposed to their laws. So their curiosity was intense to behold the little stranger adopted by Necile and her sister nymphs. Claus looked upon the immortals who thronged about him with fearless eyes and smiling lips. He rode laughingly upon their shoulders of the merry Ryls. He mischievously pulled the beards of the low-browed Knooks. He rested his curly head confidently upon the dainty breast of the fairy queen herself, and the Ryls loved the sound of his laughter. The Knooks loved his courage, and the fairies loved his innocence. The boy made friends of them all and learned to know their laws intimately. No forest flower was trampled beneath his feet, lest the friendly Ryls should be grieved. He never interfered with the beasts of the forest, lest his friends, the Knooks, should become angry. The fairies loved him dearly, but knowing nothing of mankind, he could not understand that he was the only one of his race admitted to friendly intercourse with them. Indeed, Claus came to consider that he alone, of all the forest people, had no like of any other fellow. To him, the forest was the world. He had no idea that millions of toiling, striving human creatures existed, and he was happy and content. Chapter 5. The Master Woodsman. Years passed swiftly in Burzee, for the nymphs had no idea to regard time in any way. Even centuries made no change in the dainty creatures. Ever and ever they remained the same, immortal and unchanging. Claus, however, being mortal, grew to mankind day by day. Necile was disturbed presently to find him too big to lie on her lap, and he had the desire for other food other than milk. His stout legs carried him far into Burzee's heart, where he gathered supplies and nuts and berries, as well as several sweet and wholesome roots, which suited his stomach better than bell udders. He sought Necile's bower less frequently, till finally it became his custom to return thither only to sleep. The nymphs, who had come to love him dearly, were puzzled to comprehend the changed nature of her charge, and unconsciously altered her own mode of life to conform to his whims. She followed him readily through the forest paths, as did many of her sister nymphs, explaining as they walked the mysteries of the gigantic wood, and the habits of nature of the living things which dwelt beneath its shade. The language of the beasts became clear to little Claus, but he never could understand their sulky and morose tempers. Only the squirrels, the mice, and the rabbits seemed to possess cheerful and merry natures. Yet would the boy laugh when the panther growled, and stroke the bear's glossy coat, while the creature snarled and bared his teeth at him. The growl and snarls were not for Claus. He knew well. So what did they matter? He could sing the songs of the bees, recite the poetry of the wood flowers, and relate the history of every blinking owl in Burzee. He helped the Ryls to feed their plants and the Knooks to keep order among the animals. The little immortals regarded him as a privileged person and favored by the great Auk himself. One day, the Master Woodsman came to the forest of Burzee. He had visited in turn all his forests throughout the world, and they were many and broad. Not until he entered the glade where the queen and her nymph had assembled to greet them did Auk remember the child that he had permitted Necile to adopt. Then he found sitting familiarity in the circle of loving immortals, a broad-shouldered, stalwart youth, who, when stood erect, was fully as high as the shoulder of the master himself. Auk paused, silent and frowning, to bend his piercing gaze upon Claus. The clear eyes met his own steadfastly, and the woodsman gave a sigh of relief as he marked their placid depths, and read the youth's brave and innocent heart. Nevertheless, as Auk sat beside the fair queen, and the gold chalice filled with rare nectar passed from lip to lip, the Master Woodsman was strangely silent and reserved, and he stroked his beard many, many times with a thoughtful motion. With morning he called Claus aside in kindly fashion and saying, "Bid goodbye for a time to Necile and her sisters, for you shall accompany me on my journey through the world." The venture pleased Claus, who knew well the honor of being companion to the Master Woodsman of the world. But Necile, she wept for the first time in her life and clung to the boy's neck as if she could not bear to let him go. The nymph who had mothered this sturdy youth was still as dainty, as charming, and beautiful as she was when she had first to face Ock with the babe clasped to her breast, nor was her love less great. Ock beheld the two clinging to each other, seemingly as brother and sister to one another, and again he wore his thoughtful look. Chapter 6. Claus discovers humanity. Taking Claus to a small clearing in the forest, the master said, "Place your hand upon my girdle and hold fast while we journey through the air, for now we shall encircle the world and look upon many of the haunts of those men from whom you are descended." These words Claus clasped to marvel, for until that very time he thought that he was the only one of his kind on the earth. Yet, silence, he grasped firmly the girdle of the great Ock, his astonishment forbidding speech. Then the vast forest of Burzee seemed to fall away from the feet, and the youth found himself passing swiftly through the air at a great height. For long there were spires beneath them, and the buildings were many shapes and colors, and they met their downward view. It was the city of men, and Ock, pausing to descend, led Claus to its enclosure. Said the master, "So long as you hold fast to my girdle, you will remain unseen by mankind, though seeing clearly yourself. To release your grasp will be to separate yourself forever from me and from your home in Burzee." One of the first laws of the forest is obedience, and Claus had no thought of disobeying the master's wish. He clung fast to the girdle and remained invisible. Thereafter, with each moment passed in the city, the youth's wonder grew. He, who had supposed himself created differently from all others, now found the earth swarming with creatures of his very own kind. "Indeed," said Ock, "the immortals are few, but the mortals are many." Claus looked earnestly upon his fellows. There were sad faces, and gay and reckless faces, pleasant faces, anxious faces, and kindly faces, all mingled in puzzling disorder. Some worked at tedious tasks, some strutted in impudent conceit, some were thoughtful and grave, while others seemed happy and content. Men of many natures were there, as everywhere, and Claus found much to please him, and much to make him sad. But especially he noted the children, first curiously, then eagerly, then lovingly. Ragged little ones rolled in the dust of the streets, playing with scraps and pebbles. Other children, gaily dressed, were propped upon cushions and fed with sugar plums. Yet the children of the rich were not happier than those playing in the dust with the pebbles, it seemed to Claus. "Childhood is the time of man's greatest content," said Ock, following the youth's thoughts. "'Tis during these years of innocent pleasure that the little ones are most free from care." "Tell me," said Claus, "why do not all these babies fare alike?" "Because they are born in both cottage and palace," returned the master. "The difference in the wealth of the parents determine the lot of the child. Some are carefully tended and clothed in silks and dainty linens. Others are neglected and covered in rags." "Yet all seem equally fair and sweet," Claus said thoughtfully. "While they are babes, yes," agreed Ock. The joy is in being alive, and they do not stop to think. In after years, the doom of mankind overtakes them, and they find they must struggle and worry, work and fret, to gain the wealth that is so dear to the hearts of men. Such things are unknown in the forest where you were raised. Claus was silent a moment, and then he asked, "Why was I reared in the forest among those who are not of my race?" Then Och, in a gentle voice, told him the story of his babyhood, how he had been abandoned at the forest edge and left a prey to wild beasts, and how the loving nymph Necile had rescued him and brought him to manhood under the protection of the immortals. "Yet I am not like them," said Claus musingly. "You are not one of them," returned the woodsman. "The nymph who cared for you as a mother seems now more like a sister to you. By and by, when you grow old and gray, she will seem like a daughter. Yet another brief span, and you will be but a memory, while she remains Necile." "Then why is it, if man perish, is he born?" determined the boy. "Everything perishes except the world itself and its keepers," answered Och. "But while the life lasts, everything on earth has its use. The wise seek ways to be helpful to the world, for the helpful ones are sure to live again." Much of this Claus failed to understand fully, but a longing seized him to become helpful to his fellows, and he remained grave and thoughtful while they resumed their journey. They visited many dwellings of men in many parts of the world, watching farmers toil in the fields, warriors dash into cruel fray, and merchants exchange their goods for bits of wine and yellow metal. And everywhere the eyes of Claus sought out the children in love and pity, for the thought of his own helpless babyhood was strong within him, and he yearned to give help to the innocent little ones of his race, even as he had been succored by the kindly nymph. Day by day, the Master Woodsman and his pupil traversed the earth, Och speaking but seldom to the youth, who clung steadfastly to his girdle, but guiding him into all places where he might become familiar with the lives of human beings. And at last they returned to the grand old forest of Burzee, where the master set Claus down within the circle of nymphs, among whom the pretty Necile anxiously awaited him. The brow of the great Och was now calm and peaceful, but the brow of Claus had become lined with deep thought. Necile sighed at the change of her foster son, who until now had been ever joyous and smiling, and the thought came to her that never again would the life of the boy be the same as before this eventful journey with the master. Chapter 7. Claus leaves the forest. When good Queen Zerline had touched the golden chalice with her fair lips, and it had passed around the circle in honor of the traveler's return, the Master Woodsman of the world, who had not yet spoken, turned his gaze frankly at Claus and said, "Well?" The boy understood, and rose slowly to his feet beside Necile. Once only his eyes passed around the familiar circle of nymphs, every one of whom he remembered as a loving comrade. But tears came unbidden to his dim sight, so he gazed therefore steadfastly at the master. "I've been ignorant," said he simply, "until the great Och has shown me kindness and taught me who and what I am. You, who live so sweetly in your forest bowers, ever fair and youthful and innocent, are no comrades for a son of humanity. For I have looked upon man, finding him doomed to live for a brief space upon earth, to toil for the things he needs, to fade into old age, and then to pass away as the leaves in autumn. Yet every man has his mission, which is to leave the world better in some way than he found it. I am of the race of man, and man's lot is my lot. For your tender care of the poor, forsaken babe you adopted, as well as your loving comradeship during my boyhood, my heart will overflow with gratitude. My foster mother. Here he stopped and kissed Nasile's white forehead. I shall love and cherish while life lasts, but I must leave you to take my part in the endless struggle to which humanity is doomed, and to live my life in my own way. What will you do? Said the queen gravely. I must devote myself to the care of the children of mankind and try to make them happy, he answered, since your own tender care of a babe brought to me happiness and strength. It is just and right that I devote my life to the pleasure of other babes. Thus, with the memory of the loving nymph Nasile be planted within the hearts of thousands of my race for many years to come, and her kindly act be recounted in song and in story while the world shall last. Have I spoken well, master? You have spoken well, returned Og, and rising to his feet continued. Yet one thing must not be forgotten. Having been adopted as the child of the forest and the playfellow of the nymphs, you have gained a distinction which forever appears and separates you from your kind. Therefore, when you go forth into the world of men, you shall retain the protection of the forest, and the powers you now enjoy will remain with you to assist you in your labors. If you have any need, you may call upon the nymphs, the ryls, the knooks, and the fairies, and they will serve you gladly. I, the Master Woodsman of the world, have said it, and my word is law. Claus looked upon Og with grateful eyes. This will make me mighty among men, he replied. Protected by these kind friends, I may be able to make thousands of little children happy. I will try very hard to do my duty, and I know the forest people will give me their sympathy and help. We will, said the fairy queen earnestly. We will, cried the merry ryls laughingly. We will, shouted the crooked knooks, scowling. We will, exclaimed the sweet nymphs proudly. But Nasile said nothing. She only folded Claus in her arms and kissed him tenderly. The world is big, continued the boy, turning again to his loyal friends, but men are everywhere. I shall begin my work near my friends, so that if I meet with misfortune, I can come to the forest for counsel or help. With that, he gave them all a loving look and turned away. There was no need to say goodbye, but for him the sweet wildlife of the forest was over. He went forth bravely to meet his doom, the doom of the race of man, the necessity to worry and work. But Og, who knew the boy's heart, was merciful and guided his steps. Coming through Brzee to its eastern edge, Claus reached the laughing valley of Ho Ho Ho. On each side were rolling green hills, and a brook wandered midway between them to wind afar off beyond the valley. At his back was the grim forest. At the far end of the valley, a broad plain. The eyes of the young man, which were until now reflected his grave thoughts, became brighter as he stood silent, looking out upon the laughing valley. Then on a sudden his eyes twinkled as stars do on a still night, and grew merry and wide. For at his feet the cowslips and daisies smiled at him in friendly regard. The breeze whistled gaily as it passed by and fluttered and looked on his forehead. The brook laughed joyously as it leaped over the pebbles and swept around the green curves of its banks. The bees sang sweet songs as they flowed from dandelion to daffodil. The Beetles chirped happily in the long grass, and the sunbeams glinted pleasantly over all the scene. "Here," cried Claus, stretching out his arms as if to embrace the valley, "will I make my home." That was many years ago, and has been his home ever since. It is his home now. And this is where we stop for today, but we'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now.